He was bleeding. 3 men lay dead on the warehouse floor, and Minho had not made a single sound through any of it. Not when she found him. Not when her hands pressed cloth to the wound. Not when her entire body was shaking while her hands stayed perfectly still. He looked up at her in the lamplight, and every wall he had ever built came down at once, and what came out of him was quiet and final and impossible to take back. Make me hard. I want to feel every part of you. Welcome to Black Soul Romance TV series, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. 3 weeks earlier, Naomi Reed had been sitting in the back of a black company car with her carry-on between her feet and her phone pressed to her ear for the last time before the battery died. Her mother had said, "Baby, you don't have to go." Naomi had said, "I know, Mama." Then she had said goodbye, and the phone had died, and she had watched Seoul arrive outside the windows the way a city arrives when you have never seen it before and are arriving inside someone else's idea of your life. The medical bills were not abstract. They had a number. The number was specific and consistent, and it had not changed no matter how many times she looked at it. The agency had given her a different number, a much larger one. 6 months, domestic service, private residence, confidential client, the kind of compensation that made you understand exactly why confidentiality was part of the arrangement. She had not asked questions. The car turned off a road she did not recognize. It passed through 2 separate gates, each requiring its own clearance. It came to a stop before a building that did not announce itself the way wealth usually announced itself. Dark stone, floor-to-ceiling glass. Traditional Korean architectural bones dressed in something cold and deliberate, like a dynasty that had survived several centuries by refusing to need anyone's approval. It sat in the hills of Hanam-dong as though it had always been there and expected to remain. A woman named Mrs. Shin met her at the entrance. Small, efficient, with the particular economy of someone who had decided long ago that warmth was a resource she could not afford. She handed Naomi a laminated card. 11 rules, Korean and English, both sides. Naomi read them. Rule 5, do not enter the north wing without direct instruction. Rule 8, do not address the director unless spoken to first. Rule 11, underline twice, in both languages. You do not look directly at the director's face. Naomi read Rule 11 a second time. She put the card in her pocket and said nothing. Because her mother's treatment cost $4,000 a month, and because she had flown 14 hours, and because she had never once in her life been told she was not allowed to look at someone and actually not looked. She started work the next morning. The first 3 days were uneventful. The compound had a staff of 10. The director, she was informed, was rarely present. He had other properties, other offices. One of the younger staff members whispered about him with the reverence people reserved for weather systems and other forces that could not be managed. He runs this city from a distance. She said it like it was a fact of nature. He always has. Naomi cleaned methodically, with full attention, back straight, and told herself the distance suited her fine. On the 4th day, it did not. She was on her knees in the main corridor treating a watermark on the baseboard. Old damage. The kind people had looked at long enough to decide was permanent. She had not decided that. She was working with a cloth and a solution she had mixed herself when she heard it. Footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of house staff. Heavy, deliberate, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who had never once been required to move faster than he wanted. She kept working. The footsteps stopped. The silence changed. It went from empty to occupied in a way that had nothing to do with sound. She kept working. He said without preamble in English that had no warmth in it and no accent she could name, "What are you doing to that floor?" It was not a question. It was a statement from a man who had stopped using the inflection of questions years ago because the answers always came anyway. Naomi looked up. Rule 11. She had read it twice. She looked up anyway. Minho was not what the whispers had assembled in her imagination. He was tall, dark clothing. A face that looked like it had been designed with precision and restraint, as though someone had started with something severe and edited down to what was essential. A jaw that could cut stone. Eyes the precise color of deep water before a storm. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has identified something he cannot classify and is finding the inability irritating. She said, "There is a watermark that has been here for some time. I am removing it." He said, "It has been there for 2 years. 3 people before you were unable to remove it." She looked back at the floor. She said, "Then it should be gone by tomorrow." Silence. When she looked up again, he was still watching her and the expression had shifted very slightly in a way she could not name. He said, "You looked at me directly." She said, "You addressed me, Mr. King." I assumed that made it appropriate. Something moved through his face. Brief. Gone. He said nothing else. He left. She turned back to the baseboard. Her hands were completely steady. Her heartbeat was doing something loud and complicated, but her hands were steady, and that was what mattered. The watermark was gone by noon. The next morning, Mrs. Shin appeared at her door at precisely 7 and said with the flat precision of a verbatim message, "The director says the corridor is acceptable." Then she left. Naomi held this information. Then she went to start breakfast. The gifts appeared on the 5th day. The first was practical. Premium cleaning cloths, lint-free, 3 times better than the supply room issued. Outside her door when she woke. No note, no explanation, just there. She used them. She told herself it was an employer ensuring efficiency. The second was less easily dismissed. A jar of the specific shea butter she used. Her exact brand, imported from Georgia, not available in any shop she had found in Seoul. She had mentioned it once in passing to another staff member, a conversation she had believed entirely private. The jar appeared 2 mornings later. No nota, no signature. Just the jar, which meant he had either overheard or been told, either of which required a level of attention that she found deeply unsettling. She told herself it was basic employer consideration. She used the shea butter. She almost believed what she was telling herself. The third gift was different from the others. She had been staying late on a linen inventory, hours on stone floors. When she finally reached her room, her feet were making their feelings known. She had mentioned this to no one. She had not said it out loud to herself. Outside her door was a pair of house slippers, not cheap ones. Thick soles, natural fiber lining, the kind made by someone who understood that comfort is not incidental but structural. Underneath them, a card. 3 words in handwriting that was precise and spare. "Floors are cold." No name, no signature. Just 3 words, as though they were simply a fact he was delivering and not a confession that he had been paying the kind of attention that changed everything. Naomi stood in her doorway with the slippers in her hands for a long time. She was in serious trouble. She knew it the way she knew weather, not by one sign but by the shift in the whole atmosphere. She put the slippers on. They fit exactly. She started being more careful after that. She controlled her expressions when he was present. She kept interactions brief and transactional. She followed Rule 11. She moved through the compound the way she had been instructed. Invisible, efficient, present without being present. He noticed, of course. On a Tuesday morning 10 days after her arrival, he appeared in the private kitchen while she was preparing a tray. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and that particular stillness. The stillness of someone who does not need to move to own a space, and he said without greeting, "You have changed your approach." She did not look up from the tray. "I am doing my job, Mr. Kang," he said. "You are doing it differently than last week." She aligned the cups. She said, "I am following the household protocol." He said very quietly, "You are following Rule 11. She turned. He was looking at her with that expression that was not quite any expression she had a name for. Sharp and patient and too close to the surface for a man whose entire reputation was built on distance. She said, "It seemed appropriate." He said, "It looked like distance." The kitchen was quiet. Morning light landed on the counter between them. Neither spoke. The thing that had no business being between them breathed. He left without another word. She told herself she was completely in control of the situation. She was not. The woman arrived on a Wednesday 3 days later. Her name was Yoon Sua. She came in a car that announced itself. She was the daughter of a political figure whose family had maintained strategic ties with the Kang faction for a generation, which meant she moved through the compound with the ease of someone who had been given, at some point, to understand that she had standing here. She was beautiful in the architectural way of women raised to understand their beauty as a resource and to deploy it accordingly. She moved through rooms like a current. She looked at the staff the way certain people looked at furniture. Necessary, neutral, invisible. Until she saw Naomi. Naomi was descending the main staircase with fresh linens when Yoon Sua looked up from the foyer. The pleasant blankness of her expression did something immediate. It sharpened, not into hostility, into something more precise than hostility. Into the particular focus of a woman who has registered a variable she had not previously accounted for. She spoke to Mrs. Shin in rapid Korean. Mrs. Shin responded with the careful diplomacy of someone who had navigated many such conversations by giving nothing away. Sua looked up at Naomi and smiled. It was the kind of smile that lived entirely on the mouth and said very clearly, in any language, "I see what you are. I am not threatened. I am simply filing this away for later." Naomi came down the stairs at the same measured pace. She went about her work. She showed nothing. She was very good at showing nothing. She had spent years being the person in the room that people needed to see be unfazed. She knew this performance. She was excellent at it. But in the laundry room, her hands needed a full minute before she trusted them with anything foldable. Minho did not acknowledge Sua's presence in any way Naomi could read. He moved through his afternoon with controlled efficiency. He did not look at his guest the way someone looked at a person who had strategic family ties and shared history. He looked at Naomi once, across the length of the main hall. The look lasted under 4 seconds. It communicated more than most conversations could. Sua saw it. She left before dinner. Then came the second kind of danger. His name was Park Hyun-woo, a logistics coordinator connected to one of the lower-tier operations. Mid-30s, easy confidence, the kind of man who had learned that women found him appealing and had never been given sufficient reason to examine that information closely. He came to deliver documents. He stayed longer than necessary. Naomi was working in the outer courtyard when he stopped beside her and said in careful English he was proud of, "You are the new one. From America." She said yes. He said, "You are very beautiful, for a maid." She looked at him. She understood that he believed this was a compliment. She said, "Thank you." She went back to her work. He stayed. He offered his name and asked hers. He told her which restaurants in the neighborhood were best. He offered his number twice without being asked. From the second-floor window directly above the courtyard, Kang Minho stood at the glass. His usual stillness was controlled. What he had now was different. It was held, like a fist. Park Hyun-woo was summoned to the director's office that afternoon for a routine document exchange. He emerged 9 minutes later looking like a man who had briefly been inside a room where the air pressure was wrong and had not fully recovered. He did not speak to Naomi again. She did not ask what had been said. She did not need to. She understood enough about this house and this man to know that certain consequences moved in the space between an observation and a decision, and that Minho occupied that space with total and uncontested authority. She sat in her room that night with her wool slippers on and her hands wrapped around her mug, and she thought about a man who noticed everything and said almost nothing and acted on what he saw in ways so deliberate and so quiet that they were almost more frightening than any noise would have been. She asked herself whether she was afraid of him. She decided she was afraid of something, but it was not him. It was the way her hands had stopped being entirely steady when he was nearby. It was the way the air in a room rearranged itself when he entered. It was the way she had started memorizing small things. The particular pause before he spoke, the exact angle of his shoulder in a doorway, the way he drank his coffee standing at the window every morning as though the city below owed him something and he was patiently waiting for it to pay. She was afraid of what all of that meant. The terrace happened on a Friday. Mrs. Shin appeared at her door with a message. "The director asks that you prepare the East Terrace at 7 this evening. Tea service. 1 person. Not a meeting. Not a guest. 1 person." Naomi prepared it with her full attention and then turned to leave. He was already there. He stood at the railing with his back to her, looking at Seoul in the particular way she had heard about, like he was waiting for the city to give him something it had not offered yet. His hands were in his coat pockets. The night was cold and he did not appear to notice. She set down the tray quietly. She turned to leave. He said, without looking back, "Sit down." She stopped. Staff did not sit with the director. This was not in the rules because it had never needed to be. She said, "I should return to my duties." He said, "Your duties are finished." "Sit down." She sat. He came to the table. He poured his own tea. He looked at her across the small table with the city burning behind him and he said, "Tell me about Atlanta." She said, "How do you know I am from Atlanta?" He said, "I know the background of everyone under this roof. It is not vanity. It is how I keep people safe." She thought about this. She said, "Atlanta is loud. I have not missed the loud parts." He said, "What do you miss?" She sat with it for a moment. She said, "My mother's Sunday cooking, the quality of October light in the South. Being somewhere I do not have to translate everything about myself before anyone can understand me." He was quiet. He said, "And here you translate everything." She said, "Here I translate everything." She looked at him. "But some things," she said, "some things translate." They sat in the cold above the city. He drank his tea. She had not made herself a cup, and he had not thought to prepare one, because she was learning. A man who did not instinctively provide for what people had not directly asked for. Who was learning, slowly, in the specific way that very controlled people learned things that some people did not ask. He stood. He went inside. He came back with a second cup. He placed it before her, poured without ceremony, returned to his seat as though none of it required acknowledgement. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Do not thank me for small things." She said, "I will decide what deserves thanks." Something crossed his face, brief and gone. Almost a smile. Almost. And besties, that right there was the beginning of the end of the very careful professional distance both of them had been trying to maintain. He was falling and he knew it with complete clarity and absolute inability to stop it. Like, share and subscribe right now because this story is only just beginning and where it goes next will break your heart in the best way. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. He took a call at 2 in the afternoon in the corridor outside the West Study. She was in the adjoining room and the compound carried sound in ways she had not expected. His voice dropped to its lowest register, which she had come to understand was the most dangerous register. She heard the word warehouse repeated 3 times. She heard him say, quietly and finally, "How many?" By 4, 3 of the regular security staff had left in vehicles that were not the usual vehicles. By 6, the entire compound had changed its atmosphere, tighter, sharper. The remaining staff moved with more purpose and less conversation. Mrs. Shin appeared at Naomi's door at 6:30. "The director has been called away. Please remain in your quarters this evening." Naomi said, "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Shin said, "Everything is being managed." She left. Naomi sat on her bed with a book she did not read and the wool slippers on and her mug in her hands and the sounds of the compound around her. The sounds of a place holding its breath. At 10:42 she heard the cars. They came through the gate too fast. Then the controlled urgency below. Voices low and fast. Mrs. Shin's quick footsteps. Something else she could not name, something that moved her to her feet before she had finished deciding. She went into the corridor. She found them in the main hall, 2 of the security team with a weight between them. The weight was Minho. His shirt was dark and the dark was spreading. A wound along his left ribs held with cloth that was doing everything it could and losing. His face had the same expression it always had. Controlled. Spare. Except she had been studying this face for 3 weeks and she could see what lived underneath the control now, and what lived underneath it was pain. She did not think. She crossed the hall. Mrs. Shin said, "You should return to your room." Naomi looked at the wound. She looked at the cloth. She looked at the people surrounding him who were managing the crisis with competence and without care. She said, "I have medical training. 4 years as a trauma volunteer in a Chicago ER. Move." They moved. She worked. She asked for supplies with the voice she had learned in emergency rooms, the voice that was not a request but a direction, and she received everything she asked for. She cleaned the wound, assessed, dressed it properly. The bleeding slowed. She sat back on her heels. She breathed. When she finally looked at Minho's face, he was already looking at her. He had been watching her work, through all of it. He looked at her now with the deep water expression, the unreadable one, except it was readable. It was readable because the control had given way somewhere in the blood and the warehouse and the 3 men who were not coming home, and what was left was just a face, just a man, looking at her without anything between them. She said, "The wound is not deep enough for a hospital. You need to stay still and change the dressing in 8 hours." He said nothing. She began gathering supplies. She told herself this was finished. She would go back to her room. He would go back to being the director. Tomorrow everything would return to its correct positions. Then he said it, quiet. In the way he said everything that mattered, without volume, without decoration, as though the words were simply true and needed nothing added to make them land. He said, "Make me hard." She stopped. He said, "I want to feel every part of you." The compound was completely still. The remaining staff had withdrawn without being asked. It was only the lamp and the quiet and the sound of Seoul so far below it was barely a sound at all. She looked at him. She understood. She understood the way she understood most important things, not by analysis but by immediate and complete recognition. She had been paying attention to this man for 3 weeks. She had been learning him the way she learned everything she cared about, which was thoroughly and without rushing. She knew what he was not saying. She knew what he was. He was not asking for something cheap. He was not asking from want alone. Though want was there, she could see it. She would have had to be blind not to see it. He was asking from something older and more desperate than want. He was asking from emptiness. From a man who had kept everything at such a distance for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be made of something real. Make me hard. Like iron is made hard. Like winter makes roots hard, pressing into the earth so deeply that nothing above ground can move them. He had been soft in the wrong places for 3 years, soft with grief and with absence, and with the kind of loneliness that very powerful people accumulate behind all the walls they build. He needed someone to press into all of that and make it hold. I want to feel every part of you, not the professional version, not the careful, controlled version she had been presenting since she arrived. Every part. The steadiness and the fear and the grief she had been carrying from Atlanta folded into the collar of every uniform she wore. The kindness that had been growing in her chest for him despite every effort she had made to prevent it. Every part of what she was, so he could know he was not alone with what he was. She understood all of it, completely and immediately and at a depth that frightened her. She moved closer. She lowered herself to the floor beside him, against the wall, the way she had sat beside people in Chicago ERs at 3 in the morning when medicine had done everything it could and what remained was just presence. She took his hand, the one that was not pressed to his wound. She turned it over. There were scars she had not seen before. His pulse was elevated but steadying. She held his hand the way you hold something you intend to keep. She said, "I see you." He was very still. She said, "Not the version you show everyone. What is underneath it? I see that too." His jaw tightened. Not from anger. From the specific effort of something trying to hold itself together. She said, "You lost 3 people tonight. You are allowed to feel that." He said, "In this life you cannot feel everything." She said, "I know." She looked at him. "But it is tonight. It is this room. And you are not the director right now. You are just a person who is hurting." The silence between them was different now. It had been many things in 3 weeks. Professional, careful, pressurized. Now it was something that had no professional name and required none. Something that had been accumulating since a corridor and a watermark and a pair of wool slippers left outside a door without a signature. He said very quietly, "I have been careful not to want things." She said, "I know." He said, "It has not been working." She said, "I know that too." His hand turned over in hers and held back. She stayed. She sat beside this controlled and quietly devastating man on the floor of his compound. This man who had been watching her since the morning she had looked directly at his face when everyone else looked away, and she let herself be fully present in it. No distance. No protection. Every part of her exactly as she was. Later, she would not be able to say who moved first. What she would remember was the lamp, the quiet, his hand in hers, and then not only his hand. What she would remember was the absence of fear, not of him, which she had braced for, and not of wanting, which she had not. What she would remember was the feeling of being seen completely by someone who had been watching from the very beginning. The night closed around them. The compound was still. And in the morning, when the light came through the east wing windows, there was something new in the air of the house. Something that had not been there before. Something that had no professional name and required none. Stay tuned for part 2, besties, because what comes next is going to test everything you just witnessed. Everything. Please like, share, and subscribe to Black Soul Romance TV series and do not miss a single moment of what happens when the most dangerous man in Seoul realizes he has something worth losing. She was gone before he woke. She had not planned it. She had not made a decision in the clear way that decisions were made. What happened was that the light began to come through the east wing windows and she found herself thinking clearly and with terrible precision about every reason this was an unmanageable situation. About the fact that she was staff. About the fact that his world had men in it who did not come home from warehouses. About the fact that she was Naomi Reed from Atlanta, Georgia, and he was Kang Minho, and those were not equivalent facts no matter how his hand had felt holding hers in the dark, no matter how long the night had been, no matter what his face looked like when the control was completely gone. She got up. She found her slippers. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap and she breathed until the breathing worked. She told herself she was being sensible. She was being exactly as sensible as the situation required. Minho woke to an empty room and a feeling he did not have language for, because the last time he had felt anything adjacent to it had been 3 years ago, and he had worked very deliberately since then to avoid feeling it again. He lay still. He looked at the ceiling. He was aware of the wound at his ribs. The dressing applied with steady, practiced hands. The careful instructions delivered in the voice of a woman who had spoken to him with the same precise directness with which she had dismantled a 2-year-old watermark. Completely. Without asking permission. He did not come to find her that morning. He had meetings. He had a faction that needed managing after the previous night. He had 3 families to notify, and he would do that himself because he always did it himself, which was the specific tax that leadership placed on a man who understood that distance was easier to maintain when you never had to look into the faces of the people your decisions cost. He moved through his day in the controlled way he moved through everything. Naomi cleaned the east wing. She was thorough. She was efficient. She was the image of a person who had not spent most of the night on the floor of the main hall with her hand in a man's hand, saying things that could not be unsaid. She followed Rule 11. He noticed. He said nothing for 4 days. She told herself he had accepted the distance. She told herself that was the appropriate outcome. On the 5th day, he found her in the library. She was doing an inventory of a collection that had been cataloged under the wrong system for years. She was cross-referencing against a printed list when she heard the carpet absorb his footsteps and looked up, and he was already across the room and already sitting down at the table she was working at, without asking permission, without preamble. He looked at her. He said, "You left early." She said, "I thought it was appropriate." He said it was not. The library was very quiet. The kind of quiet that accumulated in rooms with many books. He looked at her across the table with the open expression, the one she had only seen when the walls were completely down, and she held her list and kept her face composed. He said, "I am not asking you to make a decision about anything. I am asking you not to decide it is already over before it has properly begun." She said, "Mr. Kang." He said, "Minho." She stopped. He had never offered that. In this compound, in his world, he was Mr. Kang and the director, and those were not titles for convenience. They were architecture. He was offering to let her pass the architecture. She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. She said, "I am still staff here." He said, "I am aware of what you are here." He held her gaze without blinking. "I am also aware of what happened in that room and what it meant, and that you are sitting across from me right now, performing a version of yourself that I have already seen through." The silence in the library changed quality. She put the list down. She said, "I am afraid of what this costs." He said, "So am I." She looked at his face. The whole of it. No management. No composure. Just him. She said, "Then why are you here?" He said, in the same quiet voice he used for everything that mattered to him, "Because I have been afraid of things before." He paused. "I have always chosen the version of myself that avoided them." He met her eyes. "I am trying to choose differently." She held this. She let it sit in her chest and be as heavy as it was. She picked the list back up. She said, "This collection has been filed under the wrong system entirely. It will take several evenings to correct." He said, "I am aware." He did not move from the chair. She said, "It will take several evenings." He said, "I have several evenings." And so it began again, differently than before. Without the professional distance, without Rule 11, without the careful performance of invisibility she had been maintaining since the morning she woke up afraid. It began with evenings in the library, and with meals she began preparing in the private kitchen because she had decided, on a specific evening when he came home looking like a man who had not eaten since the previous day, that the Han residence was going to have food in it that actually smelled like a home. He ate in the kitchen now, at the island, on a stool. In the way of someone who had decided this was where he ate and was not going to explain it. She learned things. She learned that he had memorized the floor plan of every property he had ever owned because it was how he processed anxiety, which he would not have called anxiety. She learned that he had not played the instrument in the music room in 3 years, not because he had forgotten how, but because some rooms take on the shape of what they have lost and become impossible to enter. She learned that he had a younger lieutenant named Lee Junho, who trusted him completely and watched Naomi with the expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this for a very long time. She learned about Yoon Seo on a Thursday evening in the West Study. She had not asked. He had not offered. What happened was that she was cleaning the shelving and found a photograph tucked behind a row of books where a visitor would not see it, but a person who lived in the house would know it was there. A young woman, laughing, not posed, caught mid-laugh with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who had never learned to be strategic about her joy. She placed the photograph exactly as she found it. She said nothing. That evening, Minho came to the study and stood at the window. She was finishing the last of the shelves. She said very quietly and without turning, "You can talk about her if you want to. It is not a requirement, but you can." He was still for a long moment. He said her name was Yoon Seo. She was 26. She liked terrible jokes and was afraid of nothing except losing people. His voice was the same as it always was, controlled, precise, without decoration. She made every room louder. He looked at the city. "I used to find that exhausting." He was quiet. "I would give everything to find it exhausting again." Naomi said nothing. She kept her hands on what she was doing and she listened. He said, "I spent 3 years keeping everything at a distance because I believed that was what grief required of me." He paused. "I think I was using grief as an excuse, because distance was something I was already good at." She said, "The people we love change the texture of silence. When they go, the silence is a different shape." He turned from the window. He looked at her with an expression she did not try to name. He said, "Yes, exactly that." The room held them. And the thing between them, which had been building since a corridor and a watermark and a pair of wool slippers and a terrace in the cold and a warehouse floor, continued to build without asking either of them for permission. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under her door before she woke. It was written on plain paper in his handwriting, 3 sentences. "I have spent 3 years not wanting things. You have made that impossible. I am not skilled at this. I am asking you to be patient while I learn." No signature. He never signed anything. She read it 4 times. She folded it and put it in the pocket over her heart. She wore it there all day without mentioning it. And besties, if your chest just did something, if that letter just got you the way it got her, please subscribe to Black Soul Romance TV series right now and keep watching, because what is coming is going to make this moment look calm by comparison. Hit that notification bell. You do not want to miss what happens next. 2 days later, the danger came. The way danger in his world always came. Quietly, from the direction no one had been watching. His name was GM Tseo. Head of the GM faction, the rival syndicate that had been studying the Kang territory for 2 years looking for the specific crack in the armor through which to insert a lever. He had tried money. He had tried territorial negotiation. He had tried direct violence twice and lost people both times. He was, according to Minho's intelligence, a patient and methodical man who was very good at waiting for the right vulnerability. He had found one. It had a name. On a Tuesday afternoon, Naomi was at the market. She had her basket and her list and a cold, clear Seoul day that was beautiful in a way she had not expected Korean winters to be beautiful. She was at the produce section when the black van pulled into the parking lane at the edge of the market. She noticed it because she had been living in this compound for 5 weeks, and she had learned to notice certain things. The van was there, and then 2 men were there, and the junior security member, who was supposed to be 10 feet behind her, was on the ground before she had finished understanding what was happening. She ran. She was fast when she needed to be, smart about it. She cut through stalls in the afternoon crowd, kept her head low, her movement unpredictable, the way she had learned to move in certain neighborhoods in Atlanta at certain hours. She watched the two men sweep past as she pressed into a doorway. She waited 4 minutes. Then she walked calmly into the nearest shop and asked to use the telephone. She called the compound. Mrs. Shin answered. Naomi said 3 words, "I need Minho." He was on the line in 30 seconds. She spoke quickly and clearly. Location, van, 2 men, the security guard down. She spoke the way she had learned to speak in emergency rooms when panic was still a luxury and clarity was the only thing that helped anyone. Level. Deliberate. Complete. He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then do not move. Lock the door. I am coming. He arrived in 14 minutes. Not men he sent. Him. Personally. Getting out of the car before it fully stopped, covering the distance between the vehicle and the shop doorway in long, fast strides. He looked at her face first. Then her hands, her feet, her face again. Checking. Cataloging with the thoroughness of a man who needed to verify every single thing before he would allow himself to breathe. He put one hand on her face, just his palm against her cheek. Brief, warm. The warmth of a man whose entire exterior was controlled and precise and whose hand in that moment was neither. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said no. She looked at him. She said, "Are you?" He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Not physically." She understood what he meant. She put her hand over his on her cheek. She held it there. He took her to the car. He sat beside her the entire ride back, not reaching for his phone or the reports or any of the things that would have been professionally required. He sat beside her. He did not touch her again. He did not need to. What happened after was not witnessed and not asked about. What Naomi understood was that Kang Minho, after confirming she was safe, made a series of phone calls in a closed room. And that by the following morning GMTCO had discovered that 14 legitimate business arrangements between the GM and Kang factions had simultaneously ceased, that 3 financial entities he relied upon had come under regulatory review, and that 2 of his most reliable allies had inexplicably decided to take extended international travel. Minho came to find her that evening. She was in the library. She was sitting at the table she had spent 3 evenings reorganizing. She had a book open. She was not reading it. He came in and sat across from her and looked at her with his whole face. He said, "It is handled." She said, "I know." He said, "Tisio understood that you are not a variable. He will not make that mistake again." She closed the book. She looked at him steadily. She said, "How long can you keep me safe?" He looked at her. The question was not a simple one, and he was not going to answer it simply. He said, "As long as I am breathing." He held her gaze. "And I am very difficult to stop breathing." She said, "I know." She looked at the closed book. She said, "I am not asking you to be invincible. I am asking you whether this is a world I can actually live in." He said, "It is a world I would not wish on anyone I cared about." He said it plainly. "It is also the world I have. I cannot give you a different one." He paused. "What I can give you is everything inside it." The library was quiet. The city moved outside the windows. She said, "Naomi read from Atlanta, Georgia, did not move to Seoul to fall in love with a crime lord." He said, and there was something in the very back of his voice that was almost something. "No." She said, "And yet." He said, "And yet." She looked at him across the table. She said, "I have been in love with you since the slippers." He was completely still. She said, "The slippers with no name on the note, the shea butter, the extra cup on the terrace. Every small thing you did without asking for anything back." She met his eyes. "I fell in love with a man who watches everything and shows nothing and acts anyway in the quietest ways possible." She paused. "And I am terrified of what that costs. But I am done letting fear make my decisions." He stood. He came around the table. He sat beside her, not across from her, beside her, the way he had sat beside her on the floor of the main hall, close enough that the warmth of him was specific and present. He said, "I have not loved anything in 3 years." He said it the way he said everything true without performance. "I believed the capacity had left me." He looked at her. "It has not left me." He looked at her in the particular way he had looked at Seoul from his windows, like he was finally receiving the answer the city had been withholding for years. "You are every part of what I did not know I needed." You looked at my face when everyone else looked away. You removed a mark that everyone before you had decided was permanent." He took her hand. He said, "I am not asking you to ignore who I am or what my world is. I am asking you to choose it anyway." He held her hand the way he had held it on the floor of the main hall, careful and complete, like something precious that had decided to hold him back. "Not because you have to, because you want to." She looked at their hands. She looked at his face. She said, "I choose it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need you to say that again so I am certain I heard it correctly." She laughed. It surprised her. It surprised him more. His expression shifted, opening, the way it had shifted on the terrace when she had told him she would decide what deserved thanks, and this time it did not close as quickly. This time it stayed. This time it was everything he was, visible and present and entirely hers. She said, "I choose you, Minho, the floors and the warehouse and all of it." He put his forehead down to her hands. He stayed there. She put her fingers in his hair. The library held them in its quiet way. The city moved outside, indifferent and magnificent, doing what cities did. And inside, in a room lined with books and the quiet evidence of a life that had been lived very carefully and was finally being lived for real, something took hold. Several months later, Seoul was in spring. The cherry blossoms were happening in that particular way Seoul cherry blossoms happened, with enormous enthusiasm and complete indifference to whether anyone was watching. The whole city felt like it was recovering from something and choosing, loudly, to be alive. In the estate in the hills above all of it, in the east wing that was no longer the staff wing, Naomi stood at the window in the morning light with her hands resting on the gentle swell of her abdomen. She had found out 4 days ago. She had held the information privately for 4 days, not from fear, not anymore, but from wanting to be alone with it briefly, just her and this small, stubborn new thing, before it became part of the larger world of them. Minho appeared in the doorway. He had come from his morning briefing. He was still in his jacket. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her for months now, without management, without the professional composure, with the whole face that she had spent all her time in this compound learning and that she now knew the way she knew her own. He saw her hands. He crossed the room. He stood behind her and his hands covered hers, both of them, where they rested on the swell. He did not speak. He did not need to. Outside, Seoul moved and breathed and did its indifferent, magnificent thing. She said, "We are having a baby." He was completely still for a moment, the particular stillness that preceded things that mattered enormously. He turned her gently and looked at her face. No composure, no control, no management of any kind, just joy. The raw, almost unbearable joy of a man who had spent 3 years deciding he was finished with hoping and had been proven, in the most absolute and irreversible way, magnificently wrong. He said, "We are having a baby." She said, "We are having a baby." He put his forehead down to hers. He held her, and their hands were between them, and outside the cherry blossoms were doing what cherry blossoms did, and the city was doing what the city did, and none of it cared about anything except its own survival. But inside, in a room in the hills above the Han River, in a house that had once been filled only with silence and grief, and the careful distance of a man who had decided to stop needing things, something was growing. Something small and stubborn and brave. The way all real things are. He had asked her to make him hard. She had pressed her presence into the cold and the distance and the grief like a blacksmith presses heat into iron, and she had made something out of him that held. That did not bend. That would not break. Not now. Not for anything. And in doing so, she had become the one thing in his world that made him want to be soft. She leaned into him. He wrapped both arms around her, around them both, careful and complete and permanent. The proposal happened on the terrace, the same terrace, in the cold, in the exact spot where she had first sat with him and he had gone inside to get her a second cup. He had a ring. It was not in a box. It was in his palm, plain and simple, because he was not a man of ceremony and had never pretended to be. He said, "I do not know how to do this correctly." He looked at her. "I only know that I want you in every room, for every year. I want to build something with you that outlasts everything we have survived." She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She said, "You are asking." He said, "I am asking." She closed her fingers around the ring and around his hand. She said, "Yes." Just yes, one word. Because between them, the simplest things had always carried the most weight. They married in spring. Small and deliberate, and exactly them. Her mother flew in from Atlanta with tears already started in the departure gate, according to her own account. Her brother tried very hard not to cry and failed entirely during the vows. Minho's people were there, the inner circle, the ones who had watched him close himself off for 3 years and had watched with a relief they could not name as the closing slowly undid itself. Lee Junho, Minho's most trusted lieutenant, who was not a man given to emotional expression, had to excuse himself briefly during the exchange of rings. Minho stood at the end of the garden in his dark suit and watched her come toward him in ivory, without a uniform of any kind, wearing the dress she had chosen herself and her natural hair, the way she had worn it the first morning she had come down the main staircase with fresh linens in her arms and changed everything. His face, when she reached him, was completely and entirely open. No management, no distance, just him. She took his hands. She looked at his face. She thought about a woman who had been told not to look at this face. She looked at it with everything she had. He looked back. That was the whole of it. Everything else, the vows and the rings and the celebration that went until the early morning with her mother attempting to teach his most serious lieutenant a line dance that required absolutely no shared language. All of it came after. All of it was wonderful. But the beginning was the look. It always had been. And in the east wing window, 7 months later, in the morning light that came through at the exact angle Naomi had memorized since her first week in this house, they stood together with their hands held over the gentle evidence of what they were building. A man who had decided to stop hoping, and a woman who had come from Atlanta with a mother's medical bills and no expectation of anything except survival, had built something neither of them would have had the language to predict. Something that would have a name soon. Something that would one day be told the story of its own beginning, about a watermark and a pair of wool slippers and a warehouse floor, and 3 words on a card written without a signature, and would hear it the way all good stories were heard, with wonder and with warmth and with the quiet, unshakable certainty that some things in this world are worth every single difficult step it took to reach them. This is where Naomi and Minho's story finds its fullness. Not in the danger they survived, or the silence they broke, or the distance one of them had built for 3 years, and the other had simply and completely refused to respect. In a house in the hills above a city, in a man learning, slowly and with great effort, how to stop keeping everything at arm's length. In a woman who had come to clean floors and stayed to rebuild something that had been standing empty for far too long. If this story found you tonight, besties, if Minho broke your heart in all the right ways, if Naomi made you feel everything you came here to feel, share this video with someone who needs a love like this one. Subscribe to Black Soul Romance TV series, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us which moment got you first. Was it the slippers? The terrace? The warehouse? The letter with no signature? Tell us. We read every single one. Like, share, subscribe. We love you, Black Soul Romance TV series family, and we will see you in the next story.